Okay, hello, and we're back. Okay, this time I am joined by the Stephanie Wright of Babbel. Stephanie is the head of learning content at Babbel. Her department is the heart of Babbel's language learning expertise, where linguists, educators, instructional designers, and media professionals craft all of Babbel's educational content. Wow. It's pretty impressive, Stephanie. I'm really looking forward to this talk. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me and for giving the intro. Yes, the department and all the people who work with me are extremely impressive. So actually my main goal at work is just to ensure that my colleagues' expertise is visible and accessible in our product and by Babbel learners. Nice. So I'll turn off my camera so that the full screen hopefully is visible to everybody. Let's see. Can you confirm for me that you can see everything? Let me go check the chat. Yeah, awesome. Then onward. So today we will talk about a topic quite close to my heart because I am a sucker, honestly, for systems and frameworks and models that help all of us communicate better and more meaningfully. So sometimes, actually oftentimes, we don't give a second thought to the millions of systems that we move through and rely upon every single day. We have our objectives and our goals, and we take the path of least resistance to reach those. That's normal, everybody does it. For example, let's imagine that you need to get from point A to point B. Over there. We could do this and take this circuitous, winding path all the way around. It still gets us there. Or we could do something like this. That path feels a lot less intense, right? You expend a lot less energy to get to the same place. For repetitive goals and objectives, the paths that we take over time become patterns. They become muscle memory, and we end up calling those habits. And then for all other objectives, just in general, we employ patterns still that make us expend as little energy as possible to achieve our objectives. When things don't go to plan, we can get frustrated because suddenly maybe a pattern isn't working out and it requires us to expend energy to readjust. For this red line, we go around where we have to redirect. That's also why it's hard for us to alter patterns that we followed for a while. We can call this need to expend energy as bad luck. We can also call it friction, which is a favorite word of many tech companies these days. In the end, we are caught up together in millions of systems of different sizes. And when we think about digital language learning, this universal truth can be a really reliable North Star. So in the remaining 17-ish minutes that we have together, this is what we'll cover. First, some basics. We'll have a quick overview of communication, linguistics, and social information architecture. We won't go into depth here. After all, there are people who earn degrees and spend decades of their careers on these topics. In fact, I work alongside many of them at Babbel. Many of them work in my department, which is so cool. Then we'll consider the needs of a digital learning environment and the role of friction in language learning. And finally, the more traditional information architecture bit, the technical stuff with frameworks and tactics and models. But again, not too deep given the context today. So onward. Communication. It's how we understand ourselves in relation to literally everything else. It requires that we exchange, both sending and receiving, information. So you think about a casual conversation or a big family gathering or, I don't know, a deep sea diver gesturing okay underwater to communicate they are in fact okay. Maybe Morse code or an API. Whatever form it takes, the goal is to achieve understanding on all sides of the communication. So now linguistics. Human language has this pretty cool characteristic of sitting at the intersection of creation and infinity. That sounds really grand and maybe silly, but seriously, like for me, it's very cool that human language is largely acknowledged to be limitless. in the sense that it can be combined and deconstructed and reordered and reimagined, and it's always evolving. And it is what we make of it, right? So of course, this makes it a very fascinating field of work for maybe the more investigative personalities. And these people have given us the field of linguistics, which describes the many systems and subsystems of language and how meaning is created through them. Now we change gears slightly and we add in a digital layer. For as long as information has existed digitally, there have been systems emerging to govern all of that. Many of the rules of real life systems hold true. We still have objectives, we still have goals, and effective communication by the most efficient means is ideal. Building such systems is the domain of information architecture. So defining objects based on their meanings and their structures and their functions, their interactions, combinations, and more. But real life is unpredictable. Actually, like quite often, it's unpredictable. People are unique, inherently social creatures. So social information architecture considers how digital systems shape the movements and the interactions of people in digital spaces, and therefore the communities that grow within them. Okay, so let's pivot firmly in the direction of digital language learning specifically. It is really hard work to digitize great teaching, but it's even harder to digitize a supportive learning environment. But why? Well, first, there is no easy path of least resistance. There will be friction, and so it's absolutely crucial to build in ways to manage learners' energy. Also, the types of digital interactions possible multiply when you add in people to allow for more types of human-to-human connections. And then finally, something every teacher knows all too well, it's easy to keep learners engaged with stuff they like, but learners aren't experts. They don't know what they don't know. And yet we still have to find tactics that actually bring learning success for them. So, creating a supportive learning environment online, digital and interactive spaces, it's crucial, but it's really hard. So how do we work through that or work past that? Well, first there's this word. Why do I keep talking about it? Why do I keep repeating it? Why do I keep talking about expending energy in general? It's because the typical language learning journey looks like this. Over time, there's a positive trend upward, but through the journey, there are lots of dips. You can see them underscored. And it's not just any topic we're talking about, it's language. So literally the mode of human communication. Now think about how hard it is for people who want to come back for more, or for people to want to come back for more, when they have setbacks in this fundamental act of being understood. Yeah, it's tough. It takes a lot of energy to engage with this type of learning where friction is the default. So for our digital spaces, we have to build for that, not against it, not despite it, but for it. Now I have primed you for some complexity. Here it is. We're entering the very short, I promise, slightly more technical section of this presentation. So we start by covering 3 basic information architecture concepts. First, ontology. That refers to meaning, what it means for something to be the thing that it is. Like, what does it mean to define a specific learning activity as a grammar trainer? Or, a totally different sort of analog real world example, what does it mean to define something as a toaster? Ontology is describing and refining the meaning of things. Taxonomy, on the other hand, or on an additional hand, is the structure of how information is grouped, classified, and labeled. So with our toaster example, now we know what it means, we know what a toaster is. How would we indicate the different structural components behind that meaning or inside that toaster? Basically, like a blueprint for how to build a toaster. That's taxonomy. Choreography is how meaning, so ontology, and structure, so taxonomy, fit together and interact with each other. It's like the digital pathway. I recently happened upon this amazing example for this. Think about IKEA. The warehouse for IKEA is taxonomy. It's where all of the items are grouped and classified and labeled and stored. Our toaster's in there on a shelf. But then on the actual showroom floor, these same products are organized in the best way possible to provide value and meaning to customers. That's the choreography. There's a literal path of interactions that customers follow, and you see that toaster at a specific moment on purpose because it should matter to you then. So next we move into tactics, like how do we tactically build energy management into our products? Unlike in a traditional classroom setting, a digital language learning environment is one that's really in constant competition with all other environments where anyone could be spending their time, attention, energy, money, really. So this topic of energy management is crucial to keeping learners engaged in a system where not everything will be easy or fun all the time, like we talked about friction being necessary for learning success. Therefore, we think about tactics to classify and support energy management. On the left side, you see some tactics describe the ways to increase energy that people want to put into the system. It increases their buy-in. One of the ways to do this is called mechanics. So this refers to designing interactive elements in a way to increase learners' buy-in. There are tons of examples, really, but it can encompass things like gamification. So that's badges and points and streaks and leaderboards and timed activities and more, as well as feedback that can prompt dopamine rushes in learners. So things like acknowledgement and praise and feelings of success. Another tactic over here is games. Now, caveat, we have some wonderful game experts at Babbel, and they've done a great job keeping us all conscious of the fact that gamification and game-based learning are not the same thing. So games, game-based learning, it's an activity, an active learning activity with measurable outcomes and specific learning objectives. It's different from just the mechanics of gamification, like adding a badge on at the end. But it still is one of the ways to increase the energy that people want to give into a system. Other frameworks, so on the right-hand side, describe ways to just decrease the energy that people need to put into the system. You know, that's like automating things that don't require their attention. So if you're into UX, you'll know this word, affordances. For everybody else, it just means like making it clear how something could or should be used. So this is like the Microsoft Word paperclip, you know, that helpful context setter. Or, very cool, a door with no handle. If there's no handle, you automatically push on it, right? It makes it clear that you have to push to walk through that door or walk through that entryway to use that door. Another tactic over here is mapping. So this is like your orientation in space. Whenever you have a working map in mind, navigation takes much less energy. So you could think about moving to a new city, getting acquainted with the metro map. And initially, it's really crucial that you keep spending energy to look back at that map. But over time, after you've built the mental map, you can be on autopilot while you navigate. This is the same sort of activity that we want to, or a tactic that we want to employ around activities for learners in a digital learning environment. Now, in order to really observe and quantify and make inferences about how language learners move through digital spaces, we've got to be intentional about the information architecture foundations. So now we've come to it, the boxes and the lines part that you probably expected from the beginning. Let's take the example of a grammar trainer. Let's imagine this is a grammar trainer, and it's going to be introduced to the learner for the very first time. There are some key things that we need to think about, some foundational patterns. One is content. What learning activities happen here? What are the desired learning outcomes? These 4 blocks on the left can represent the distinct components of a grammar learning activity. It's where the learning content lives. Then we think about structure. So how is the information organized? And are there any innate mechanics? You can think back to mechanics like dopamine rush. What can elicit that? or badges or streaks, something like that if you're thinking about gamification, as well as like truly the structure. So let's think about this. Grammar is hard for most people. It's not necessarily the most fun thing for most language learners. And for this particular exercise, it is the first time a learner is seeing it. So perhaps the structure here should be hierarchical. That is, maybe in a specific order. You want to really strictly guide a learner through, because it's the first time they've seen it, it's hard. So the way to represent that would be sort of this cascading setup or structure. There are so many others, but this is just an example. This is also where any of those mechanics about like gamification and dopamine rushes are built in, are defined. Then we have a boundary. There's always a boundary for anything, even at work. We're always trying to figure out our own, figure out other people's. It's no different online or in a digital language learning environment. We're always trying to figure out what the boundary should be and how it works. So here specifically, it refers to, what does the information sharing look like? Does this model share info out? Does it take it in? And then what learner permissions are required to access it? So maybe, let's imagine, this is a premium grammar trainer. So it requires maybe a special permission to access. This boundary pattern is where we would define that. And finally, scale. So how big or how small is this model, is this pattern, this like collection of patterns, really a grammar trainer? How big or small is it relative to others in this learning content system? And it could be the whole system, or it could be a small part of the system. Either way, you just need to know the size of it and how it fits in relative to other things. So in the end, the goal is to create a collection of interoperable components of learning. This means that they work together, they're connected, they can work independently, they are not necessarily, well, they build part of an ecosystem, we'll put it that way. I really like the word interoperability for this, even though it is quite hard to pronounce, I'm realizing on camera. Like on the previous slide, how we looked at the foundational patterns that made up the grammar trainer, the same can apply to all different types of learning activities. And to really lean into the social part of information architecture, we can apply a really cool technique used by architects. So like real architects, the kind, or original architects, perhaps I say that, the kind who build physical buildings in our real world. They often use this thing called a bubble diagram, which is more or less what you see here. It allows one to visualize the foundational patterns as they'd be used by people. So inside every one of these bubbles, we can imagine that we have the content and the structure, sort of like in that grammar trainer example on the far left. But the size of the bubble here is scale, and the location of the bubble indicates how closely tied the interactions between bubbles are based on the choreography. So those pathways that the learners can take. This will probably sound to many, especially those of you who are into UX, like a learner journey, a different flavor of it. And it's quite similar. So many of these fields have overlaps. Like in reality, all of these different fields are sort of Venn diagrams on top of each other. And people go and they study and they specialize, but the boundaries, like we just talked about earlier, sometimes are really fluid. Sometimes information goes in or out or is shared. So while this bubble diagram is used by real world architects, it's quite similar to things that you would see in other fields as well. But to go into granular depth here on the sort of additional social elements, so describing the connections and communities that people participate in throughout this choreography, that would take a lot more time. We unfortunately don't have time for that today, but I'm really interested in it. So if you would want to talk about it with me, I'd welcome that. For now, we'll move to final thoughts. Primarily because there is no one way to do social information architecture. The point is just that you need to be intentional about the patterns that you define and the digital space that you build with those, because it does matter. And for learners to achieve success in a digital language learning environment, the right architecture can make all of the difference. It can build for friction, it can manage energy smartly, and it can increase learner success. Let's see, I think that is it, actually. Quite rapid fire, went through it really quickly, but I'll end by just saying thank you to Chatterbug for giving me the chance to speak. Thanks to all of you for choosing to spend some time with me here today. And if anything you heard piqued your curiosity and you want to go deeper, because I would love to, feel free to reach out. I'm not sure how to share my contact information, but I'm sure somebody can help me with that. And then before I properly close, I want to give plugs for my exceptional colleagues. So Gianluca and Emanuele are giving an Italian mini lesson at 3 p.m. and Berlin time specifically. And Jen is presenting on social media trends at 5:30. I'll be there. I hope to see you there. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was really great. I particularly loved the analogy about IKEA, right? Because everybody knows there is just the two sections of the store where you have like all of the materials, but then they have it showcased so nicely. And it actually makes you want to buy it, right? It's like when you see it, when you see this table in the midst of all these other items in their living room, showroom, it makes you want to actually buy that item. So that was a really great analogy. Let's see, we have a couple of questions in the chat, and we have a few minutes for those.
Yeah.
And let's see, so first, someone said, would you mind giving another example of mapping?
Mapping.
Yes.
Yes. Honestly, there are so many different examples of this. I'm going to try to think of one. The one that always jumps to my mind is this Metro map, because I use it at work. Anybody from my office will have heard me say this like dozens of times. It's probably like old and tired by this point, but it's really anything that allows you to create a mental map. And so if we think about, for example, the digital space, that can be even the site map or the navigation bar at the top of an app that allows you to like seamlessly move through things, that you use it sometimes if you go repeatedly back to a place. After a while, you're like, oh, I know where to click. I know where to go. It's probably like, actually, sorry, I have one really cool example. I just thought of it. So if you have some favorite apps on your phone, right? And you are used to like closing one and you scroll and you click on one. If you ever do a test and you think about just moving that app a little bit, the widget, your thumb or your finger will still go back to where it used to be because you built that mental map.
Right.
Yeah. It's so wild. It's like psychology is so cool.
But that's so interesting.
Like,
so mapping is almost like muscle memory in a sense.
Yeah, totally.
Very interesting. Okay, let's see. We'll take a couple more. What resources could you recommend as a starting point for IA?
Ooh, okay. So I have some, honestly, the way that I got into this was through a very non-technical avenue. So I have these resources and I'd be happy to give those to you because if you start with words, then it's a little bit easier, for me at least it was, to proceed to the place where you actually are looking at tons of boxes and it looks very technical. Like that you kind of need an intro for. I have a list of resources I would absolutely love to share.
Perhaps you can pop them in the chat for people.
Yeah, I'll need to go like grab them from somewhere, so it might not be immediately, but it can be today. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Very nice. Next, which forms of content do you recommend combining the most effective learning experience?
Oh, this one, we could take it in so many different directions because there are so many different answers. So let's imagine our use case is an A1 learner, right? They've had very little exposure to the language. Let's do that. Otherwise, it'll be too broad. Something that you might not want to do or that you probably shouldn't do is immediately throw them into a conversation-based activity. They don't yet have the words. They haven't sort of like added those to their memory bank yet. And that's just going to set somebody up for probably not the ultimate success. So the opposite of that would be sort of like short, measured introductions to different concepts, vocabulary, not too much grammar at the onset because that's not what people need. And then some passive exposure to how the language sounds, what the like phonetics are, how things sound when they're used in real life. So you have passive exposure, active learning, but not trying to ask too much of people too soon.
Yeah, and that's that increasing the want and decreasing the need, right? Of
Yeah.
that friction. Absolutely.
You're
Great
such
answer.
an active listener. Thank you. This is cool.
Well, well, this is a very, very interesting topic for me. So the whole time I was just like, ah. Okay, let's see. Let's maybe take one more question. Let's see. Is there a crossover between language learning repetition, burnout, and learning the grammatical basics? That's actually a very interesting question.
Let me try and see if to make sure I've understood correctly, and please, like in the chat or whatever, to correct me if I'm wrong. You're talking about like burnout from the sort of rote memorization that might be required if you're just presenting vocabulary in a quite dry way, or just at all. And then thinking also about grammar. Like, is that correct? That it's too much too soon to also add grammar onto it?
Yeah, that's what it seems like. Yeah, that sort of, that rote memorization, right? Then you can get burnt out from that. And then, but you do need to perhaps learn those grammar basics, right? So how do we sort of mitigate that crossover, yeah.
Yeah. So this is exactly what you'd also just mentioned, Danielle, before, and thinking about the energy. This is where we can use things like affordances. One, we make sure our content isn't super long. Like, we're not trying to throw 20 different words at somebody and expect they remember them immediately, or even from day to day. You provide opportunities for review, but with the affordances, you make it really easy to contextualize what's happening. So perhaps you have that Microsoft Word type of context setting, or you remind people why they're learning these words or how they're going to use them once they do remember them. Just sort of really giving that context that makes the learning experience more textured, and not sort of cramming things down people's throats, because that never works well. It's not a fun
Yeah. No, not at all. Not at all. Let's see. Maybe, okay, this is the last one, truly.
Yeah.
People are asking great questions. So how do you manage the tension between the goal of reducing friction for learners and providing learners with the learning experiences they need to progress? And I think that's kind of what you actually kind of just answered that question a little bit.
It's also, though, I mean, that is I don't know what we'd call it, the golden question, or something like the ultimate goal. But there's definitely no right way, because there are so many different types of people who have different needs. And so if you design something that works for one person, it's probably not going to work for somebody else. That's just, they're inherently such complex systems. But definitely one of the ways to mitigate this is by putting a lot of effort into thinking about the content structure and the content architecture. Because the more granular on the back end you are with the different pieces that you have and how you can combine them, the more time you can actually spend interpreting how learners behave as they move through those pieces of content.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very, very good. All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie. We are actually going to move into our next session. So thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed that.
Likewise. Thank you. Good luck with everything else.
Thanks.
Bye.